Good day. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Javed UP Public Programs. Today we have the Guernica Conversations in a conversation with Blessing Ngobeni as well as Siseko Kumalo. So today's discussion is about the Guernica Conversation, which of course is an interpretation of Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which was done in 1937. Of course, this is an interpretation of the horrors that happened during the Spanish War between the 1937 to 1939. So for those who are not aware, we have a public program, and the Javed Arts Center uses artworks as a starting point to elect content. So what we're doing here today is basically looking, just as a brief introduction, looking at 5 works in 5 minutes, which of course speak specifically to the idea of the Guernica and in the South African context. Now these works here at the Javed Arts Center, we have 4 exhibitions which are currently running, and these 5 artworks that I'll be speaking in this introduction are specifically from the 101 Collecting Conversations, a signature works of a century. The first work is by Albert Adams, South Africa, 1959. Like Picasso's Guernica and Dumile Feni's African Guernica, it is a landmark painting which directly addresses the injustices, destruction, and pain brought about the repressive political ideology. Peter Makubani's Sharpeville Massacre, Sharpeville Funeral, more than 5,000 people were at the graveyard, May 1960. Now this work, as we know, Makubani's practice was basically around photojournalism, and what he does is to document specifically the political life and current events experienced by people in everyday life. And this is one of the works which speak to this, which doesn't offer really the aesthetics, but rather the information as the key and importance of the conversation. Cyprian Mpo Silakwe, Stop Crying Mother, in 1969. Now, this work's title in itself gives context to the grief of a mother in the foreground of the image, crying uncontrollably, perhaps for a child, maybe a father or a husband that won't come home. It also speaks to the fundamental social and family dislocation that apartheid system engendered, and which blights our society, of course, till this very day. We also have, for the 4th one, Sam Tlengetwa, It Left Him Cold, The Death of Steve Biko. I mean, the title in itself, of course, speaks to the comment that was done by then Justice Minister Jimmy Kruger in response to hearing about the brutal death of Steve Biko and his detention in 1977. The exaggerated scale of Biko's head is defamiliarizing and unidentifiable, and of course this speaks to not only the concept around that, but also exactly what happened during the time of apartheid and how people were stripped out of their identity and defamiliarized in so many ways. The presence in this work of the apartheid police suggests that the power and authority over this vulnerable body of Steve Biko. Now this is the 5th work, and of course just in my 5th minute, by Case Karma Art Project. This also is called the Case Karma Guernica, made in 2010. Now the Case Karma tapestry represents the conflict between the Eastern Cape Amaxhosa and the Eastern settlers in 1779 and 1879. The tapestry shows a devastating rot of HIV in the Eastern Cape. This suggests a slow disintegration of the entire generation, the grief and the mourning that follow, as well as the resilience of those that remain behind. So these are the 5 artworks in 5 minutes that really speak to the conversations that we'll be unpacking today. So just as we have our first speaker, which is Siseko Kumalo, who will basically be speaking about Dumile Feni's African Guernica. Just a brief introduction on Siseko Kumalo. Siseko is the editor-in-chief of Journal of the Decolonizing Disciplines. His research focuses on the epistemic violence, justice, feminine and queer identity and theory, violence, education and sustainable development, and higher education and transformation. He serves as the Literary Association of South Africa in his executive committee and is a Nelson Mandela Rhodes Scholar. I will now give it to you, Siseko. Looking forward to the conversation.
Good morning, friends, colleagues, and fellow South Africans out there. As indicated, my name is Siseko Kumalo, and I am going to share with you this morning a philosophical reading of Dumile Feni's African Guernica. Feni's Guernica expresses the contested existence of blackness and indigeneity in the land of their forebears. By this I mean to suggest that Feni captures in chilling form the changes and forced reconfigurations that define indigenous ontology owing to colonial impositions. One can read this artwork in tandem with the poetry of William Wellington Gopa, which was published in 1888, as has been done before, or located within its historical contemporaries, i.e. the music of artists like Letambulu. Intertextual reading in this case provides for a better understanding of what the artist captures and expresses through the artwork, which I suggest was the desire for the constitution of an inclusive demos. In this particular contribution, I locate Feni's artwork, which was a contribution in itself to the Black Archive, in conversation with Letambulu's probing question titled Buza, a song that came out in 1978. My conceptual framework in locating Feni in conversation with Mbulu seeks to demonstrate how these artworks detail and express the vexing anguish of black ontology under the heel of colonial oppression and domination. To begin with then, Dumile Feni's African Guernica is but one example of what can be understood as an impressive artistic oeuvre that details and theorizes the fact of blackness in the South African context. This is to say that Feni, the artist, applies himself to understanding, capturing, and detailing the lived experiences of blackness through his artworks. The work of detailing the fact of blackness in this way comes as a result of the challenges posed by the apartheid state towards blackness. Put differently, black artists like Feni, through their own lived experiences, as well as through observing the changing socio-political, socio-economic, and cultural values of blackness, were compelled into action. Under the oppressive state apparatus of apartheid, the act of developing artworks for black artists was an act of resistance. This claim is better understood when one reads the Black Archive between the 3 decades spanning the 1950s all the way through to the early 1980s. Simply put, the burgeoning socio-political critique that was coming out as a result of the implications of apartheid legislation necessitated the work of thinking through the lived experiences of blackness. I am suggesting here that one cannot fully appreciate nor understand the artistic genius of Dumile Feni's artworks, or artworks such as Dumile Feni, if one removes this work from the socio-political context that defined the artist's lived experiences. While this claim might be read as a radical politicization of artists, it becomes clear to the reader that this is not a hyperbole if one takes seriously the contribution of artists such as Letambulu. This is to say that in the artworks, or in these artworks, these black artists treated, or rather analyzed, the implications of oppression and injustice along with the derivative outcomes of said injustice. Black artists sought to revive, sustain, and jolt to action blackness and indigeneity in moments where the indigene seemed to have resigned themselves to the reality of oppression and injustice. The claim detailed here with respect to how black artists were agitating for change in the social conditions that defined and continue to define blackness and indigeneity is seen in the way in which blackness was and continues to be critical of the changing definitions of social values in our societies. By this, I am suggesting that black artists used their artistic medium to challenge the ways in which black life was being reconfigured by the socio-political realities that defined the country. This is seen in the critical question posed by Mbulu, wherein she inquired about the reason behind the fear that blackness and indigeneity has towards its own children. To demonstrate the point being made here, I want to walk the reader logically through the challenges that were observed by black artists, which substantiates why I make the case for reading Dumile Feni's work in conjunction with Leta Mbulu's music. In the first move, we have black ontology being reconfigured by the legislative framework that sought to and was in some respects successful in undermining the humanity of blackness and indigeneity, such that the indigen's own values were no longer of high regard to the indigene. Crudely, through this first move, we bear witness to the attempts at the dehumanization of blackness and indigeneity. In lamenting and detailing this first reality, we have Feni's African Guernica behind me here. When the reader pays careful attention to the artwork, one will notice that Feni is playing with two representations of being in the composition. To the top right-hand side of the artwork, the reader will notice a fading representation of human figures. These figures seem to be walking into the distance, disappearing from view with their backs turned to the viewer. To say something about this decided form of representation, even in cursory form, it would seem to me that Feni here is lamenting a state of being that is fading out of view as a result of the reconfigurations that are being imposed on the ontology of blackness and indigeneity. This is to say that it seems to me that Feni is making a stated observation about the changing ways of life that are now characteristic and beginning to define black ontology, right? And this was, of course, back in 1967 when this particular artwork came out. His statement seems, to me at least, to be lamenting what has now become, right? What has now become of blackness, a lamentation that takes on vivid representation in the form of the foregrounded images or the foregrounded figures in the artwork. Foregrounded in the composition are two figures that are atop two heads of cattle. The one on the left-hand side is depicted with defined facial features, which is depicted with sharp teeth that are representative of fangs, right? And this is, of course, to suggest the reconfiguration of black ontology such that it becomes something akin to an animality, as it were, right? The second foregrounded figure seen right on the right-hand side of the artwork is even more worrisome, depicted as three-legged with a dislocated face and undefined facial features. On the bottom left-hand corner of the artwork, we see a figure that seems to be a baby suckling on the udder of a cow. With this figure that supposedly looks like a baby, Feni invites us to consider in very reflexive ways the question of nutrition as it is mediated through the impoverishment of blackness through dispossession. This requires that we further inquire about the attendant role of cattle as it is constitutive of black ontology. This is to say, what role does cattle play within the makeup of black identity? This is to say that the cattle in the life of blackness plays a very critical role and function. Seen as the provider of sustenance and nutrition within Zule as the tool used to prepare the fields with the aid of imitanti, cattle become the signifier of nutritional sustenance through working the land. In providing amasi nobisi, inkomazi further becomes a central component of the indigenous diet. Moreover, as the resource that gives us isidwaba sikamakoti emzini, cattle play the role of socially constituting the family through ilobolo likamakoti and the attendant rituals that are constitutive of including umakoti as a legitimate member of the new family, as umntwana wasemzini. Finally, as the accompanying mechanism to the land of the dead, seen in the use of the head of cattle sacrificed at the death of an elder, cattle become the intermediary that connects the world of the living and the living dead, the ancestors, as it were. This is most poignantly expressed in the hide of the accompanying cattle used as the burial shroud of the dead. In his use of cattle then in the artwork, Dumile Feni invites the reader to consider how all of these components of black life were being dismembered owing to colonial imposition as well as dispossession, which demanded that blackness denounces cosmology and embrace Eurocentric dogmatism in the form of Christianity. In the second sense then, with these stated changes having defined the life of the indigent, we have Mbulu's composition that thinks through the implications of these changes. And it's useful to note that Dumile Feni does this artwork in 1967 and Leta Mbulu releases Buza in 1978, 11 years after this particular artwork was done by Dumile Feni. Leta Mbulu then subsequently asks, Ndiyabuza, abazali bayoyikani inzalo yabo. Leta Mbulu is one of South Africa's most prolific artists whose work continued to contest the amorality of the apartheid state, even as she was in exile. As noted above, in the 1960s and 70s, with these 2 decades that saw the implications of the legislation that was designed to ensure the complete extermination of blackness in the country of its forebears, black artists both here at home and abroad were applying themselves to the project of thinking through the implications of this legislation on the indigent. In many instances, what I am suggesting is that black artists were thinking through and theorizing the fact of blackness even as they were excluded from knowledge centers, i.e. the university. And this was, of course, being done in artworks as well as in music, as I am suggesting in my argument. It is for this reason that I maintain that in music we see modes of theorizing the fact of blackness, even as we were excluded from institutions of higher learning. And of course, it is, interesting to suggest that today, I, as a black man, am sitting in a knowledge production institution at the University of Pretoria at the Javid UP Arts Centre. If we consider the role then of the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 1957, a legislative mechanism that was designed to ensure that the indigent was alienated from themselves through the classification of the indigent's cosmology as witchcraft, a classification, by the way, that was encoded in the penal code of the country, I maintain that in outlawing the ways of being of blackness and indigeneity, a process that went hand in glove with the violence of imposing Christian dogmatism as the only religion of the heathens, who through the European gaze were seen as the Hottentot and the Kaffir, as detailed by J.M. Coetzee in his white writing, this particular move eroded societal values such that this lack of self-knowledge manifested as the violence witnessed in our black communities. And I would suggest then that Dumile Feni's artwork begins to represent, in many ways, this particular erosion of black family values. The erosion, or this eroded sense of self that is derived from an internalization of white lies about us, manifests as violence within the black community. Put differently, the erosion of our values through the criminalization of our cosmologies has the derivative outcome of making the violence of whiteness no longer the labor of whiteness. It is now, due to the internalized lies of whiteness, blackness and indigeneity that continues the work of white violence through black on black violence. And again, this is captured fundamentally and poignantly in Dumile Feni's artwork. This violence has been documented historically by a series of artists and writers, but I want to direct my reader specifically to the work of Leta Mbulu and how she theorizes this particular violence. Mbulu asks, Aibo ndiyabuza, abazali bayoyikani inzalo yabo. This question, first posed in the late 1970s, can once again be posed in the contemporary day with the fear that was first chillingly described by Mbulu in 1978, still defining black social life in the 21st century. To claim that Mbulu chillingly describes fear in the refrain to her composition is rooted in the Zulu aphorism, ukuzala ukuzelula amadolo. This aphorism describes the place and role of childbearing in the framework of Zulu cosmology, with this claim being uttered in instances where the parent sees their offspring, aiding them in the upkeep of the homestead. Insofar as children were a proud signifier of wealth, life, and abundance, the idea of parents fearing their own children was unthinkable. In this respect, filial piety was a central organizing value within the broader context of black life, a value that was undermined and denigrated as blackness and indigeneity were only seen for the value they added into the colonial economy, i.e. as cheap labor. To radicalize the severity of the challenge that was posed by Mbulu in the above-mentioned assertion, I invite the reader to consider the continuation of the corruption of these values in South African society today. In the contemporary context, this corruption manifests as literal corruption in the economy and state machinery in the country. This reality is the reason behind my suggestion, wherein I ask us to consider the implications of these white lies. Moreover, as the reader will recall, I ask us to consider the effects of these white lies as they have been told about us, the indigent, and how successful they have been in facilitating moral corruption that has us continuing to consider such questions even nearly 3 decades of liberation and freedom. Now, this is to suggest, specifically as we reflect on June 16, that the concept of freedom and liberation in the South African context is an elusive concept, specifically as it relates to blackness and indigeneity, and it is in the artworks of these artists that I have been discussing that we see this elusiveness of these concepts. In pointed form, I maintain that the relevance of this question, seen in parents who fear their children as their offspring have become beasts, as we see in Dumile Feni's representation, right? Unrecognizable, with children becoming unrecognizable beings in their very own neighborhoods and homes through the consumption of substances such as iwunga. The question still has incredible relevance 4 decades later into democracy in the contemporary South African context. And it is with this particular insight that I suggest that these artworks that we see, i.e. the work of Dumile Feni, read in conjunction with Letambulu's Buza, these artworks reveal a particular conception of how it is that we need to begin understanding ideas around freedom and liberation in the South African context. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Siseko Kumalo, for that. Such a way to kind of think and unpack these concepts around freedom, these concepts around liberation, the concepts around blackness. So right now, I am joined by Blessing Ngobeni. So please tell us a bit about specifically this work and why the title.
Tuleng, I would suggest that at some point I tend to be clear about what I say in my work and why I say those things, because already these commentaries are displayed, I mean, in different mediums, you know, in terms of like in the social media, in terms of when you go to the township, for instance, those are subjects that are displayed that need to be taken out and then be shown out there, you know. So basically, specific the democracy in masturbation piece. I did the piece. It was like a collective, different pieces of work. But this specific, it was commenting on how the democracy itself. It's just a name that has been making the youth to feel like they are living the life, you know, whereas the idea behind the democracy for me is when we, the youth, also take over and contribute in terms of how we want this democracy to shape and help us to grow in terms of, you know, economy. Our economy, for instance, it has divided in different groups, you know. There is that group, there is that group, there's that level where it's more of like democracy is a dustbin, you know, for me, because it became a dustbin in such a way that all the talent, the beautiful minds, the great thinkers, they dump all these things in that name, you know. So for me, bringing the masturbation part of it is when things like what is going on right now with the country, everybody is flat. And the only those that are on connected system, they are the ones that are enjoying the fruitness of what we called the democracy, you know. I mean, the freedom that we thought it is coming, I still like thinking is not yet here, you know. It's dead, you know, because the system made black people to believe that if there is a face of their own in the power, then they will automatically also be helped to participate and be part and parcel of eating the economy, eating the money, should I say. But in this sense, you know, it becomes very difficult for the youth to ignore that, because like people like us, we cannot ignore that because we have seen it, we've been part of it. we happened that at some point we moved, you know, because we used our madness to achieve, you know, to push harder beyond what other people think of it, you know. We have great thinkers, for instance, whom they've came from different universities, they've degrees, they've all this that they have, but their degrees are masturbating in their spaces because they cannot use them to, you know, you remember when somebody masturbates, it's a waste, you know. So, meaning at some point we're wasting so much thinkers, so much great contributors who can contribute towards shaping our own economy at large, you know. Hence, already this division that comes with not haves is the one that also creates things like xenophobic around ourselves, where we tend to hate ourselves, you know. We tend to see the next person as, you know, I don't know if this is a kind of jealous or something, but it is because we don't have these opportunities that are at some point given away to, you know. For instance, I will give you an example with what's going on right now with Africa. Africa has given away huge projects to the Western companies. Such China, you know, is the one that, you know, is now taking all the shares, you know, taking all the resources, you know, whereas those resources supposed to be making the youth of today see life better. You know, when you think around that area, automatically you get angry. And then when you get angry, me as an artist, whatever that I say in the painting, it's what I see, it's what I feel, and it's what I hear out there, you know.
So, yeah, I mean, you're speaking a lot also about what Siseko spoke about downstairs, about the idea of freedom being an elusive concept, and really the idea of it being a jerk-off concept as well. So I know, of course, today, as you mentioned, it's Youth Day, it's Youth Month, and we're speaking around these issues of the youth and what these conversations are in terms of this elusive concept of democracy. You're speaking about moments of our economy, who has privilege upon that, who has the have-nots and the haves. But I just want you to speak to me a little bit about what I know Siseko spoke about black on black violence, and you spoke about the ideas of jealousy. You spoke about the idea also of xenophobia. How do you think we are as a country now, and with this current situation, where do you see this going?
I think what we should start eliminating as the youth, you know, like, because the youth already, some of them, they have the idea of where we want to go from now. We want to achieve, we want to be involved, you know, we want to be invited to have a dialogue with the elders, you know. But when you look at the elders, you cannot change the elders to not go to church, because the person believes, but what is behind that religious thing is very dark, you know. You cannot change a person who is forefront as a leader who is 60 or how many years that is old to think for us on the bottom. So when you think around those things, we want to be invited to the dialogue. We want to be part and parcel of change, you know, because change occurs when one is willing to change. Therefore, we're willing to change, but if the elders, they are not showing us the better way to change, therefore they must give us a chance to be part and parcel of the leadership, for instance, because you cannot live with the old mind, you know, forever. That's why we will never change. We need to be involved and mingle, you know, in bringing up change towards ourselves, change towards, you know, because when you look the infrastructure, for instance, most those buildings, they were built long time ago, for instance, and then the people who are living there is the youth. And the youth, by living there, they don't see what is outside those spaces. They are inside, and their brain are also demarcated in that, so they cannot be able to enjoy the landscapes of Africa, you know, to just drive and see how beautiful is these landscapes, and to think of like, if I can get this piece of land, I can change my life and the people around me and those that are willing to come and collaborate with me, So what we need, for instance, right now as a youth, we need to work as a team. We need to start bringing the content together and execute those contents together and be able to say, if we're thinking of farming, for instance, farming will help so many people. But if we think about material, you get your money, you go to Europe and you further take the money away. That's not how we want. We want us to have a local thinking. Like we think about, okay, Puleng, you have a product that I think I can use. You too, you can like, hey, so we vice versa around that thinking. But we're stuck because the old folks, what they are thinking about us is to advertise those things to us and make the more they advertise to us, we just end up like give up, like I don't have that car, I don't have that thing. But we have as a youth to move away, unite, think critically about our own and start executing those ideas.
Thank you, Blessing. And I mean, as you're speaking, I'm looking at the work, and I know that there are already a lot of moments that you're talking about. And right now, when we're speaking about the youth and the integration between young and old, I'm just looking at this statement of "Don't teach me nonsense," and I'm quickly thinking about Fela Kuti's "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense," and these conversations around even the idea of where we are right now in June 16, and the idea of institutions, schools, infrastructure that speaks to a very rigid, very solid way of doing things. And now you're speaking about how one can begin to break away from those moments. I mean, what would you?
For me, I think I get guided by great like messages. I mean, people like Fela Kuti, they are great musicians. Their idea was to free Africa at some point, but because of you cannot, the great voices, they are always eliminated, remember. I mean, we have our own Steve Bikos, we have like so many leaders that were eliminated because they wanted to change. So at some point, for me, bringing those ideas into my work, I'm trying to, at some point, educate the people, because understanding when I'm constructing this kind of work, I do my research in terms of what message do I want in a certain piece, and I privately collaborate with whoever that is thinking positively. So, for instance, if you are a great writer, you might find your text in my work, because what I'm trying to do is to bend the Bible and create our own Africanism Bible way, Do you get what I mean? Because all these things that we are being fed, for instance, with the educational system, it's you get educated, you have to go to work for another person, not for yourself. So those are the things. So it
goes back to the very structures that have been already formulated for us before. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you're being conditioned to live a certain pattern that your ancestors never lived. For instance, the black person in the historical thinking, they say the black person started, history started after slave ship, whereas is a lie. Who were we before the slave ship? We were rich. We have. I mean, I like the Guernica by Dumile Feni, where there are kettles and the stuff, which connects to one of my work that is titled "A Thing of the Past Hounds." So when you think about it, it hounds because we were rich at some point, but our kettles, our stocks. For instance, when Western people walk into Africa, they see the beauty of the land. They do not think that this beautiful land, they have people of origin that are living into the land. Then they divided the pieces into pieces. Wherever the graves and the stocks and everything that was there, it remains there, and our own people chased away to gray areas. So when you think about those things, it pains a lot, because today these youth were supposed not to be worrying about wealthy because they had wealthy, you know, but because the system and the people that walked in, they took those things away. So, for me, what I want us to think of, like, as the youth of today is, let's find a way, you know. I know rioting and all this and that, it further destroys the economy, but let's find a better way to start, you know, bringing back the dignity of our own and of the dignity of our Africanism.
Yeah, and really, speaking of which, I think we should just speak it as it is, because I know you're doing amazing work with giving back to the community as well as working with youth. Can you please speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the idea of investing into the young minds, it came as an opposite of how the leadership of Africa is doing. The leadership is not investing in the youth. So for me, I thought I should do something that is more of like an initiative project that we each and every year, this is our 4th year.
So tell us about the initiative.
Yeah, the initiative basically is to prepare fresh thinkers, fresh artists with great ideas to be part and parcel of the arts industry, to bring, like, I'm inviting them to come, and then we move together as a team. So I'm not moving alone. So I want a backup at some point. You know, so yeah, more of like giving people like the youth an opportunity to showcase their work in the galleries, you know, to have a studio where there are professional artists around him, to introduce a person to different art spaces around the globe, because already this year we're supposed to take the winner to London, just for him to get more inspiration and get a global thinking.
And why didn't that
early
happen?
age. The virus, the COVID-19.
Of course.
The COVID it killed so many of our plans, you know. But we were resisting.
And vacations.
Yeah, we have waterproofs around ourselves, so we will break through. Yeah.
Beautiful.
We will break through.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to actually use this moment. Thank you for that inspiring conversation. And here we are speaking about Blessing, who is not only speaking about the idea of the integration between young and old, but how he is also already, as a young man, beginning to do this in his society, and as something that one can actually think about and learn and grow with. With that being said, we are happy to take questions right now. I'd like to bring the other speaker, Siseko Kumalo, and this is now an opportunity for you guys to just ask any questions if you have, and be in conversation with these beautiful men who are here with us today. But maybe, like, you guys are already sitting here together, and maybe we can start the conversation about things that we already picked up from each other's conversations that are actually kind of crucial to today's current conversations and where we are in our society.
Thanks for that, Bling. If I could just start off, Blessing, first of all, I'm absolutely thrilled to be sharing this particular platform with you. And you mentioned something earlier, right, which is the centrality of cattle. And again, this is something that I sort of raised earlier downstairs when we were thinking through the work of Dumile Feni. And in many respects, right, I'm curious about how, for instance, the work that you have developed, right, and the work that you continue to develop speaks to either the reaffirmation or an interrogation of black identity.
Yeah, basically already within the style that I came up with, for instance, for me it's to kill the idea of saying we have to copy things from, you know, from the history, from, you know, basically by bringing what I do into my work is that I wanted to break the chain, because I'm tired of people saying your work speak to Picasso, your work speak to Jean-Michel Basquiat and all this and that. But what I normally do is, in my work, there is almost different genres of art styles that I bring, which means at some point I'm restructuring the idea of unity around the artists themselves. I'm inviting the old masters into my work, and then invite the current living artist into my work, which means at some point I want to give the idea of saying, or respecting them, because like Dumile Feni, for instance, I did a piece. I'm sure you know the piece. It is a sculpture at Constitutional Hill titled History. I redid the sculpture in a painting form, you know, creating a dialogue between me and him. Hence, I never had an opportunity to meet him in person. By doing so, automatically, what I'm doing is I'm taking further where they left. And of course, the artwork will never die, but we need also to interrogate them, speak to them, you know, and analyze them in our own ways, you know.
And on that, I've just got one last question.
Please, go for it.
On that particular point of analyzing, and I like what you're suggesting, right? So this bridging form, or this bridging work that takes place between, I suppose, the masters, right? The black masters, your Ernest Mangoba's, Dumile Feni, Sokoto's, George Pemba's, you know, bridging that sort of archive in many respects with the contemporary proliferation of artists, black artists and black artists in the South African context. I wonder if that gives us an opportunity to begin to develop a black tradition of art, right, in the South African context.
Yeah, the other thing that I would, maybe it's more suggestive is, remember that the history that is being taught is not our own history. It's the history of the Western world, and when are we going to be able to reinvent our way of telling our own history? So by doing that, I'm trying to give notes towards the desire to have our kids being taught our own, you know. So by doing that is more of like, let's have a dialogue along together and erase what the Western world is telling us to do, and create our own dialogue without inviting them into our spaces. You know, they can analyze from the distance as they do, but they must not interfere with what,
with
you know,
the
because already
of black identity
of
and
black
traditions in art.
Yeah, because already remember that in the like of Gerard Sokoto, for instance, he was the first person that inspired me to become an artist. Then I never stopped there. He was the only person that I knew that is an artist. Then when I created my current work, then the fine artist analyzer invited me to think of Henri Breton's, the Dumile Feni, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and all other artists that they say my work fall under. Do you know what I mean? So for me, I still argue, I still think my work tries to loosen itself from that chain, to either to find its own chain, its own train, you know, towards contributing and inviting them still into the work, you know.
So I'd like to stop you guys there because we have a question from Candace. Can we blow that up a little bit? Who asks, are the speakers aware of how Picasso drew influence from African art and then later went to paint the Guernica? And if so, what is your feeling about Europeans stealing our African culture?
Can I start us off on the response? So a lot of my work, Puleng, in terms of my own theory development, specifically problematizes this very move, right? Whereby you have European modernity coming to Africa, discovering Africa, as if we were inanimate objects to be discovered. And what subsequently then happens is that it gets repackaged in ways that are so curious that we ourselves don't even recognize these particular traditions. And I'll take you to something, so I'll leave Blessing to answer the artistic question. I'll take you to the theoretical question, the question of Ubuntu, right? Whereby in the South African context, for instance, you have white theoreticians of Ubuntu. And I'll point you to a particular text that is really, really challenging for me, which is a report on Ubuntu, which was done by Leonard Prague in 2014. Repackages it completely, divorces praxis from philosophy, does some really, really curious work, and subsequently suggests, and there's even a point in the book where he talks about a certain circumcision, right, equating black thought to an uncircumcised phallus, Okay? So there are these really, really weird and problematic ways in which, even to this very day, right, white scholars, and I'll speak of scholars because I'm a theoretician myself, white scholars do this work of inventing or discovering African thought in ways that are very, very problematic. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, in my own work, I say if one wants to work in the Black archive, which is constitutive, of course, of artworks, music, literature, as well as poetry, one needs to be conversant with the languages of blackness. Because, for instance, if you look at the analysis that I develop of Dumile Feni's work using cattle, right, the concept of isidwaba, the concept of ukulima ngemithanti, using inzule, all of these concepts are concepts that a white man who doesn't know isiZulu but claims to be an expert of Ubuntu cannot begin to articulate.
Yeah, adding on what you're saying, because already for me, it starts with the professors. When they walk into a university, they lay out whatever they lay, they question and answers. That's where they get this to go back and bring the book that is written about us, you know. For me, I'm trying to, because I'm not from that, kind of scholarly, but I invent myself with the thinking that there's nothing that is below natural knowledge, because all this that came just to distract what we knew. You know what I mean? And what we knew now is a barrier between our wealthy, our progress, our to create our own securities around ourselves through, having resources, So when it comes to that Picasso, Stoll, whatever, I think for me, when I look at the history itself, when the European walked into Africa, it eliminated the history and brought that blackness started after the slave ship. Automatically, it says a lot before I comment on who stole this, because already there are artifacts that are lying in these museums. Queen Elizabeth did so much of our gold, for instance, which was taken long time ago. So when you think around that, there's no way that we can still succumb into that. We have to now start reinventing our own dignity, because Africa has lost dignity, has been torn apart, and that turning it apart, we have to work as a team to weave it and bring it back, so that it can now start producing and being something that we can consume ourselves. Not where it produces but does not being consumed about ourselves, which is very, for me when I look at it, the history has to be reinvented by us. We have to do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I see we're running out of time, but I mean, what an amazing way to kind of have these conversations that, of course, Siseko speaking about language, Blessing is speaking about the idea of culture and re-earthing, one could say, who we are as an African culture. And I hope, Candace, that speaks to the question you've asked around Picasso and the African culture. So with that being said, thank you, Siseko Kumalo, thank you, Blessing Ngobeni.